injunctions to do evil.
Dr. Craig, in that regards, those who are announced atheists who have done evil in the world, particularly in the last 20th century, the Marxists, the Trotskyites, the Stalinists, have they done more damage in your view and more evil than the Christians?
Well, this is a debate, Hugh, that I don't want to get into because I think it's irrelevant. I as a philosopher, and I mean this, am interested in the truth of these worldviews more than I'm interested in the social impact. And you cannot judge the truth of a worldview by its social impact. That's just irrelevant. Bertrand Russell, in his essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, understood this. Russell said, you cannot assess the truth of a worldview by seeing whether it's good for society or not. Now, the irony was, when Russell wrote that back in the 20s, he was trying to refute those who said that you should believe in Christianity because it's so socially beneficial to society. It was just the mirror image of Christopher Hitchens' argument, where saying you shouldn't believe in it because it's socially detrimental to human culture. But I think Russell's point cuts both ways because it's a valid point. You can't assess the truth of a worldview by arguing about its cultural and social impact. There are true ideas that may have had negative social impact, and therefore we have to deal with the truth of these, the arguments for and against them, and not get into arguments about has Marxism or Chinese communism been responsible for more deaths than theism in the 20th century.
No, I completely concur with what you say there. I mean, I just wanted to say that I think that those commandments are injunctions to do evil, but I would much prefer to say that the tribe that thought it was hearing these instructions from God to kill all of its rivals, exterminate all its rivals for the Holy Land, might possibly have had, I think it's overwhelmingly probable it did have, a need to seek and claim divine approval for the war of greedy extermination, annexation, and racist conquest that it was going to undertake anyway. In other words, I don't think there was an authority issuing that commandment, whether it was morally good or otherwise, as a matter of truth. But I would add, and I think the concession is very well worth having, that there is absolutely no proof at all that Christianity makes people behave better.
Now, wait a minute, I didn't concede that. What I said, I wasn't going to argue that because it's irrelevant, but by no means did I concede that. And I do appreciate as well the way you framed the issue about the Canaanites. I think you're quite right in saying that this is not an issue about whether or not God exists. Rather, this is a question about biblical inerrancy. Did these ancient Israelites get it right in thinking that God had commanded them to do these things, or did they, in their nationalistic fervor, think God is on our side and do something which, in fact, they weren't commanded to do by God? So that this isn't an issue between atheism and theism. This is an issue about biblical inspiration and inerrancy, and that's an important issue, but it's not one that is on the floor tonight.
Our next student question.
Hi, my question is mainly directed at Mr. Hitchens, but Christian theism, as with all theisms that claim a revelation, say that the purpose of human existence is to serve God, and Dr. Craig might want to expound on that in some way. But Mr. Hitchens, as an atheist with no transcendent being giving you a reason for existence, what then is the best way to live life, or what is motivation for living life, or what is the purpose of your existence without a transcendent being telling you what to do?
Well, I find it, you see, this is where I find it hard to accept the grammar of your question. It's as if I was only willing to concede supernatural, you want to say transcendent, I want to say supernatural, then my life would have purpose. I think that's a complete non sequitur. To me, at any rate, I'll have to just make the confession. This is as real to me, subjectively, as any William Jamesian apprehension of the divine. I don't get your point at all.
Dr. Craig, one of the written questions says, and I think it is consistent with the question from the audience, you have written that life without God is absurd, but I know unbelievers who are living fulfilling moral lives. In what way is their life absurd?
Okay, let me respond to that and to the question here that was asked. I would say that the purpose of life for which God has created us is not to serve God. Remember, Jesus said, I have not called you servants, I have called you friends. And I think the Westminster Confession gets it right when it says the purpose of human existence is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. God is the fulfillment of human existence. It is in fellowship eternally with God, the source of infinite goodness and love, that the true fulfillment of human existence and freedom is to be found. Now, when I say that apart from theism, life is meaningless, I mean objectively meaningless. This is the same distinction that we're talking about with regard to moral values. I'm saying that on atheism, there is no objective purpose for human existence. As Mr. Hitchens recognizes, eventually the universe will grow cold, dilute, dark, and dead as it runs down toward maximum entropy and heat death, and all human existence and life will be extinguished on an atheistic view of the future of the universe. There is no purpose for which the universe exists. The litter of a dead universe will just expand into the endless darkness forever, a universe in ruins. Now, of course, one can still live one's life as an illusion, thinking, well, the purpose of life is to, say, hit 40 home runs and steal 40 bases every year, you know, in the major leagues, and you draw the meaning of your existence from that. But that's not really the meaning of your existence. That's just a subjective illusion. In fact, your existence on atheism is objectively meaningless. So that's the distinction that I was making. Again, it's between objective and mere subjective illusion.
Well, I think it has it exactly the wrong way around. You see, as I was beginning to say earlier, we didn't have time in the question period. I wouldn't say that atheism was morally inferior. I wouldn't concede that for a second. I don't want to make a claim for its superiority either, but there may be a slight edge here. We don't believe anything that could be called wishful. In other words, we don't particularly welcome the idea of the annihilation either of ourselves as individuals, the party will go on and will have left and we're not coming back, or of the entropic heat death of the universe. We don't like the idea, but there's a good deal of evidence to suggest that that is what's going to happen. And there's very, very little evidence to suggest that I'll see you all again in some theme park. One nice and one nasty experience. There's absolutely no evidence for that at all. So I'm willing to accept, on the evidence, conclusions that may be unwelcome to me. I'm sorry if I sound as if I'm spelling that out, but I will. Now, you want to know what makes my life meaningful? Generally speaking, it's been struggling myself to be free, and if I can say it without immodesty, Mr. Hewitt kindly said it for me, too flatteringly beforehand, but trying to help others to be free too. That's what's given a lot of meaning to my life and does still, the solidarity with those who want to be as free as I am, partly by luck and partly by my own efforts and the efforts of others. Well, one obstacle to liberty, and that's why I mentioned it, and gave so many examples of it in history and in the present day, is the poisonous role played by fellow primates of mine who think they can tell me what to do in the name of God because God's told them that they have this power. So that's one thing I'd like to be shot of right here in the here and now. And my suspicion is, if you really ask the religious where do they want power and what's the world they care about, the next one or this one, it'll be this one every time, because they too know perfectly well that this is the only life we've got.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. It seems to me that on the basis of the resurrection of Jesus, that we have grounds for the hope of immortality. This is the foundation upon which the Christian hope is predicated. So again, it gets back to whether or not one has good grounds for thinking that Jesus was who he claimed to be and that God raised him from the dead. Because if he did, then there is hope of immortality.
But then I return your question to me, I return it to you in a different form. If there's going to be a resurrection, an ingathering, if in the end all injustices will be cancelled, all tears dried, all the other promises kept, then why do you care what happens in this brief veil of tears? Why do the churches want power in the here and now? Why do they want to legislate for things like abortion or sexuality or morality? Why bother? I mean, isn't it just as much the case, as Dostoevsky says about atheism, that without God all things are possible, that with God all things are thinkable too?
Not at all. As Dostoevsky said, if there is no immortality, all things are permitted. he said, because it all ends up the same. It all comes out in the wash the same. But if there is a God who exists, who loves human beings and has created them in his image and endowed them with intrinsic moral value and unalienable rights, then you have every reason to treasure other persons as ends in themselves. And the desire of pro-life persons to champion the lives of the unborn or the lives of the dying isn't a power grab, Mr. Hitchens. It's because they genuinely care about the lives of innocent human beings that they believe are being wantonly destroyed. So it's a very positive motivation.
Agreed, but there are perfectly good humanist motives for doing all those things, and if you want to have a reason for caring about the survival and health and well-being of others, the idea that you might depend on them for the only life you've got, and they on you for solidarity, is just as good an explanation for right action. But per contra, if people think God is telling them what to do, or they have God on their side, what will they not do? That's what I meant by the reversal of the Dostoevsky question. What crime will not be committed? What offense to justice and to reason and to humanity is not regularly committed by people who are convinced that it is God's will that they do that?
If they commit such atrocities, it is only because they act inconsistently with their worldview rather than in line with it. Jesus would not have been a guard at Auschwitz or someone who would take away the human rights of another person. You need to ask what kinds of actions are sanctioned by a worldview. And on atheism, as Dostoevsky said, it seems everything is permitted. Humanism, without God as a basis for humanism, is just a form of speciesism, a bias in favor of your own species. I think Christianity affirms the real basis for humanism.
Auschwitz is the outcome of centuries in which the Christian church believed that the Jewish people had called for the blood of Jesus of Nazareth to be on their head for every generation. It's only in one verse in the Bible, I know, but it happens to be the verse the church picked up on. I don't say Jesus would have been a guard there, that's not the point. The point is that this is not an aberration of religion, it is a scriptural injunction, as is the one to kill the Amalekites, as is the one to mutilate the genitals of children.
The issue is, would Jesus have been a guard at Auschwitz? Because insofar as people who claim to be his followers were guards at Auschwitz, they were acting inconsistently and in defiance of the ethic of Jesus of Nazareth.
Well, you should tell that to the Vatican. I mean, we know Paul Johnson, in his very friendly history of Christianity, says that up to 50 to 60% of the Waffen-SS were practicing, confessing Catholics in good standing. No one was ever threatened with discipline by the church, with excommunication, for example, for taking part in the final solution. The only Nazi ever excommunicated by the church was Joseph Goebbels, and if you like, I'll tell you why.
To the student.
His wife was a divorced Protestant.
He was going to tell us anyway.
Excuse me, Christianity does have some standards.
Next student.
I'd just like to thank both of you guys for being here. And in the interest of fairness, I know I'm playing devil's advocate here, pun intended, but I think since almost all of the questions are going to be directed towards Mr. Hitchens, I think we should have one for Dr. Craig.
They're all for both of us.
For Dr. Craig, what do you think about Epicurus' argument that if God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, if he knows about kids in Africa and that are born with AIDS, what do you think about him suggesting, him not intervening and him not changing that fact? That's a question that I've always struggled with. So I'm just wondering, could you expand on that, and I'd also like your input on it?
The problem of evil and suffering has been greatly discussed by philosophers, and I think there's been genuine progress made in this century on this problem. I think it's important to distinguish between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering, because these are quite different from each other. In terms of the intellectual problem of suffering, I think that you need to ask yourself, is the atheist claiming, as Epicurus did, that the existence of God is logically incompatible with the evil and suffering in the world? If that's what the atheist is claiming, then he's got to be presupposing some kind of hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit, because these statements are not explicitly contradictory. The problem is no philosopher in the history of the world has ever been able to identify what those hidden assumptions would be that would bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. On the contrary, you can actually prove that these are logically compatible with each other by adding a third proposition, namely that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that statement is even possibly true, it proves that there's no logical incompatibility between God and the suffering in the world. So the atheist would have to show that it is logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, and no atheist has ever been able to do that. So the logical version of this problem, I think, is widely recognized to have failed. Those atheists who still press the problem, therefore press it as a probabilistic argument. They try to say that given the evil in the world, it's improbable that God exists. Not impossible, but improbable. Well, again, the difficulty there is that the atheist has to claim that if God did exist, then it is improbable that he would permit the evil and suffering in the world. And how could the atheist possibly know that? How could the atheist know that God would not, if he existed, permit the evil and suffering in the world? Maybe he's got good reasons for it. Maybe, like in Christian theism, God's purpose for human history is to bring the maximum number of people freely into his kingdom to find salvation and eternal life. And how do we know that that wouldn't require a world that is simply suffused with natural and moral suffering? It might be that only in a world like that the maximal number of people would freely come to know God and find salvation. So the atheist would have to show that there is a possible world that's feasible for God, which God could have created, that would have just as much salvation and eternal life and knowledge of God as the actual world, but with less suffering. And how could the atheist prove such a thing? It's sheer speculation. So the problem is that as an argument, the problem of evil makes probability judgments which are very, very ambitious and which we are simply not in a position to make with any kind of confidence. Now, I recognize that that philosophical response to the question doesn't deal with the emotional problem of evil. And I think for most people, this isn't really a philosophical problem. It's an emotional problem. They just don't like a God who would permit suffering and pain in the world. And so they turn their backs on him. What does Christianity have to say to this problem? Well, I think it has a lot to say. It tells us that God is not some sort of an impersonal ground of being or an indifferent tyrant who folds his arms and watches the world suffer. Rather, he is a God who enters into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. And what does he do? He suffers. On the cross, Christ bore a suffering of which we can form no conception. Even though he was innocent, he bore the penalty of the sins of the whole world. None of us can comprehend what he suffered. And I think when we contemplate the cross of Christ and his love for us and what he was willing to undergo for us, it puts the problem of suffering in an entirely different perspective. It means, I think, that we can bear the suffering that God calls upon us to endure in this life with courage and with optimism for an eternal life of unending joy beyond the grave because of what Christ has done for us. And he will give us, I think, the courage and the strength to get through the suffering that God calls upon us to bear in this life. So whether it's an emotional issue or an intellectual issue, I think ultimately Christian theism can make sense out of the suffering and evil in the world.
As the clock winds down, I reserve the last question for myself, Mr. Hitchens.
Just on the devil's advocate point, when the Vatican asked me to testify against Mother Teresa, I discovered, which I did, I discovered that the office of devil's advocate has been abolished now. So I come before you as the only person ever to have represented the devil pro bono.
Last question.
Yeah, now, I'm not one of the, I was very intrigued by that reply and largely agree with it. If I was a believer, I would not feel God owed me an explanation. I'm not one of those atheists who thinks you can go around saying, complaining. I mean, if you make the assumption that there is a deity, then all things are possible. You just have to be able to make that assumption. At our debate in Dallas the other day, I mentioned the case of Fräulein Freisel, the Austrian woman who was imprisoned in a dungeon by her father for a quarter of a century and incestuously raped and tortured and kept in the dark with her children for 25 years. And I asked people to imagine how she must have beseeched him, how she must have begged him, and how the children must have, and how they must have prayed, and how those prayers went unanswered, and those beggings and beseechings went unanswered for 25 years. And Douglas Wilson's reply to me was, God will cancel all that, and all those tears will be dried. And I say, well, if you're capable of believing that, then obviously what that woman went through and her children went through was perfectly worthwhile. And her father was all that time, without knowing it, and apparently not particularly wishing it, an instrument of the divine will. And as I have said to you before this evening, had occasion to say, you're perfectly free to believe that if you wish.
To conclude.
I do.
You could, Mr. Hitchens, you've got 4,000 people here, tens of thousands more watching. You could do the same exchange at Wheaton, at Westmont, at Azusa Pacific, at Point Loma, at Notre Dame, at every great Christian university in the United States. Why do you think so many people come out to see debates with accomplished people like Dr. Craig and you?
It's a time for this great question to come up again. I think there are two reasons for it. One is the emergence of a very aggressive theocratic challenge in various parts of the world. We are about to see a long-feared nightmare come true, the acquisition of apocalyptic weaponry by a messianic regime in Tehran, which is already enslaving and ruining a formerly great civilization. We see the forces of Al-Qaeda and related jihadists ruining the societies of Iraq, of Afghanistan, Pakistan. We see Jewish settlers stealing other people's land in the name of God in the hope that this will bring on a messianic combat and the return of the Messiah. And even in our own country, we're not free from people who want to have stultifying nonsense taught to children in school and in science class. So there's that. It's in the news all the time. And then there's the existence of a very small group, of which I'm very proud to be a part, that says it's time to take a stand against theocratic bullying and is willing to go anywhere to debate these matters and put these great questions to the proof. So, and thank you for giving me the chance.
Yeah, I would answer the question somewhat differently. I think that what we're seeing is the fruit of modernity. In the Enlightenment, the church and the monarchy were thrown off in the name of free thought and unshackled human inquiry. And the thought was that once mankind was freed from the shackles and bondage of religion, that this would produce a sort of humanistic utopia. And instead, I think what we've come to see is that the fruit of the naturalistic worldview is that mankind is reduced to meaninglessness, valuelessness, and purposelessness. And that therefore the question of God's existence has become all the more poignant in our age because we're beginning to question, I think, the fruit of modernity and questioning scientific naturalism. I'm privileged to be part of a revolution in Christian philosophy that has been going on over the last half century that has literally transformed the face of Anglo-American philosophy. As the scientific, naturalistic, atheistic worldview has been challenged in the name of reason and philosophy, and the theistic worldview reasserted. And I believe that we're seeing a tremendous groundswell of interest among lay people as this revolution is beginning to filter down to the man in the street. So I would see us as beginning to question the assumptions of modernity and the bitter fruits of modernity that have been so evident in the 20th century. And I'm hoping that this will lead to a tremendous renaissance in Christian thinking and Christian faith.
To wrap up, then, five quick observations and some instructions. Number one, no good society prohibits debates such as this one. Number two, only confident faith welcomes them. Only extraordinary universities stage them. And only very accomplished scholars and intellectuals can make them interesting and entertaining. Please join me in welcoming and thanking our panelists. Both men, they did agree on one thing, which is that N.T. Wright is a very impressive man, I think Christopher Hitchens said. And therefore, to the viewing audience who might not know who N.T. Wright is, I recommend on Mr. Hitchens' strong recommendation that you get and read his books. I also want to tell you that I'm going to ask you to stay in your seats as our panelists exit stage right. There's a book signing. And I want to ask you if you have a book to stand in line. If you don't, please don't. And to recognize Mr. Hitchens has a 5 o'clock flight in the morning. So get your book signed. He loves to do that. But please don't ask him about his third cousin that you once met in Melbourne. Just let them get to talk to the book. So, gentlemen, I'm going to let you enter stage left here, and I'll hold them for a second. Thank you very much. Stay there so they can get around back. I want to thank Dr. Craig Hazen, Torrey Honors Institute, and everyone at Biola for coming this evening. Have a safe, productive trip home. Good night.